So just before I begin, I'd like to pay my respects and acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, elders past and present, on which this meeting takes place and we're meeting today. And I'd also like to acknowledge the parents and caregivers who gave up their time to tell their stories for this research. So, a caveat. When I said I would do this talk back in the day, I expected that I would have finished my research and I would have done my analysis. As you'll see, this is not true. I'm going to present this more like a conversation, so feel free if you have comments, if you have questions, I don't know if you want to interrupt what I am talking about. Okay, so just a bit of an intro. The work I'm really going to talk about today grew out of work I was doing with Carpentaria kids. So I've been a pediatric speech pathologist for about 17 years, and I moved to Darwin after I completed my PhD in education. And I took a job with Carpentaria. And I've been working in early intervention in children's hospitals and preschools really a long time before my work at Carpentaria. And it was a very different work environment to anything that I had seen before. And partly because they actually talk to families and they take time to get to know families. And the families were telling stories, and this was because they let them. Like, one of the questions they asked pretty early on is, what do you hope for when your child's an adult? Which is pretty hardcore if you've got a small child that has significant disabilities. And really this research came out of being there and hearing those stories, and this became a formal way to record some of the stories. Okay, since I signed up, the name of this seminar series also changed. And I was thinking about how my work actually fits in to people, place and policy. And really, when I think about it, this is about children embedded in families, families embedded in communities, and not particularly, but certainly the disability community shaped by national policy. And this is going next year when the National Disability Insurance Scheme rolls out in Darwin. It's going to have an impact on families, and we'll talk about that a bit more. So in certain ways, it's quite timely because of the NDIS. So, early intervention services, they're an educational priority for Australian children with developmental delays and disabilities. No one's really contesting that at all. We know that earlier children receive help, the families receive help, the better the outcomes tend to be. But given the parents of the conflict between children and clinical services, we don't get their perspectives as much as you think. And I really wanted to understand their perspectives of what it means to be a parent and the supports and constraints you have accessing implementing services in Darwin. So it's really, the study was designed broadly to understand that transition for many families that, I think I said that the wrong way, how they experience the system. It's this bridge between their hospital world, so a lot of these kids also have pretty intense hospitalizations or medical issues going on, and then into education, preschool and transition. And then this research is ultimately interested in just the supports and hindrances generally. When I started the study, I was a bit concerned that it was going to be a bit clinical because I have a job in school education. And as I'll talk about today, really, we spent a lot more time talking about education than I expected, certainly a lot more time talking about schools than I expected for such a young cohort. Okay, so as I've said, I wanted to know about the perceived benefits and inconveniences for early intervention. I wanted to hear their challenges. I wanted to identify the themes that arise across these narratives generally to inform the professions, and ultimately figure out what are the things that we can do as clinicians and services and agencies broadly to make these experiences better for families, because most of the literature is really about the efficacy of service models, it's not about the experience of families. And as I said, the NDIS starting next year, there's going to be inevitable changes. You can already see it in service delivery in Darwin. And a key feature of NDIS is the expectation that caregivers will have choice about the types of services that are available to their children and the amount of services they want their children to receive. And the other thing is, it really assumes that our families can all advocate for what their child, that not only can they identify what their child needs, but they're able to advocate for that, particularly when the people controlling the money might know little to nothing about early intervention or even disability. Okay, this study is a narrative inquiry. It's a methodological approach that involves collection, description, and analysis of stories or narratives that people tell about themselves and their lives. And it's really an entanglement between researcher and participants. This is not objective work. As a researcher, as a clinician, I have a relationship with Carpentaria, obviously. I'm paid here, I worked for them. I have a relationship with some of the families. Many of the colleagues they're talking about, people I know and interact with socially. But narrative inquiry is really about meaning making, and there's a big story here, and the big story is what's happening with early intervention in Darwin, where do families go, what's the experience of these families, as well as the smaller stories within that research. Okay, I'm using open-ended conversational interviews, and I'm using snowball sampling. The shortest interview is 18 minutes. I'm guessing that was an interview that basically I read the questions and they answered them, versus the longest, which was 90 minutes. The first question I ask families when I meet with them, I tell them it's going to take an hour, is tell me about your family. And for some families, I didn't really ask any other questions. It goes from there. The first group that I informed about this research were families who were already receiving services at Carpentaria. That's who I went to. And then it went out at Children's Development Team that I was doing this research. Families could contact me, and it went out through Autism NT that this was research I was doing, and families could contact me. So my goal is to interview 50 families. In a way, that was just an arbitrarily picked number. I don't know, 50, yeah, I've done 26. I've had one interview with both parents, 25 interviews with one parent, foster carer, 3 fathers, 24 mothers, and these represent 33 children or young teens. 7 families have 2 children with diagnoses, and these are families with children with autism. 25 live in Darwin, Autism on the outskirts of the suburb of Connor. And basically, we've just been adapting the protocol, the ethics protocol, as families come to me or things that I haven't initially considered. Right, sorry. So there's 33 children, 9 females and 24 males. On average, the children are 5 years, 11 months, and the age range goes from 3 to 13. And obviously, the experiences of family of a 3-year-old are very different to the experiences of a family of a 13-year-old. And I'm going to talk about this a little later. We actually don't hear much about what happens to children as they get older with disabilities, and that's been really an interesting part of the interviews for me, is hearing, well, yeah, what does happen when they're going into middle school and you're thinking about high school and they have autism? I included here some of the adjectives parents use: delightful, lovely, clever, adorable, such a great kid, cheeky, happy, very loved by his family. And I include these because I think often in the disability literature, when we talk about children that are difficult, and these children tend to be difficult when they come into classrooms and they come into various settings, we use these coded words that are polite ways of describing, like, this kid might be kind of a nightmare. And the example I'll use is, I once had an interview in the United States, and there were all these African American kids wandering around, and this lady's talking to me, and she keeps saying, you know, these are urban schools, these are urban kids. There was a real emphasis on urban. And she knew that I knew what this meant, and we have words like that we use for children with special needs. So, something nice that's come out of this research, I didn't really talk about it today, but I will emphasize in writing later, is, you know, the stories, when families tell stories of great moments with their kids and great experiences with their kids, and we just don't hear enough about that. We tend to hear about just how difficult they are. Female to male ratio, not really unexpected. In Australia, 4 times as many boys have autism as girls, and 4% of children in Australia have intellectual disabilities, but males are twice as likely to have intellectual disability in that age group. Okay, so from my sample size, you can see it's heavily weighted at the moment towards autism spectrum disorders. These families really, really want to talk about their stories. One family had a child with cerebral palsy, 3 had a child with Down syndrome, 3 had a child children with global developmental delay, one privability and one cleft palate. And this child is about to get an ASD diagnosis. He's a complicated child. I don't think that that's just cleft palate going on there, certainly. Global developmental delay is a bit of a tricky diagnosis in this day and age because it doesn't really have any funding attached to it. So, we talk about the rise in diagnoses of autism, and I think one of the things is if you've got a kid that's got all these issues going on, autism, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, I'm not sure about probability, but definitely they have buckets of money that come with those labels, which is pretty significant because you either get a bucket of money or you don't. And there isn't much that can be done if you aren't able to access services or you don't have the funding to access services. I wonder, I'm not okay, notable themes, the news, obviously stories often, finding out there's something different about your child is a huge thing. I have put quotes for many of the things that I'm going to talk about. I will not read them all. But yeah, the news, finding out your child's different at birth. I've never even seen a child like Grace. All the names in this presentation are pseudonyms in my country. When she came out from my tummy, I just see she's different from all my other kids. We were told we had trisomy 18 and wasn't going to survive 35 hours after being born. And to find out it was just a cleft palate they were picking up was the best news ever. She was diagnosed at 9 weeks after having some issues at birth and having genetic testing. It's sort of a bit of a roller coaster, I think. But yeah, I think when she first got diagnosed, I was pretty devastated. And had a lot of grief and loss, and for babies there's so much there. I find that that's what gets re-triggered when she has different health issues. And grief is certainly something that comes up time and time again with these families in different ways. Crying. When I did my ethics thing, they ask you about, what happens if people experience distress. But when people are talking about these things, they're very personal. It's not uncommon for parents to tear up, even parents that, are telling like really positive stories about their children. Or just the realization that something's different. Some parents will say, I knew something wasn't right. I knew from when he was very little. And everyone treated me like I was crazy. They just weren't listening to me. My doctor was like, just wait and see. But really, I knew something was not right. And then there are other parents who really genuinely had no idea. This example here, nobody actually told me that this could be autism, it could be something else. They just said, well, keep an eye on him. And then that girl that initiated that assessment left the childcare and nobody really followed up on it. It wasn't until he was about 3 years old that they refused to move him out of the toddler's room, and I said, oh, that's not really good, what's going on? I've certainly been that person in my life. I've seen children, I just thought, man, this child definitely has autism, and never wanted to be the one that said to families, I really think you need to do something. Participating in this research, I think clinically, I'm much more likely to say to a family, actually, I think there's more going on here. I think we need to seek assessment. And partly, as I'm going to talk about, it's because the process is so long. If people have concerns and they don't say anything, and then it's 2 years before the process even starts, it might be another 2 years before the child gets a diagnosis. You have just wasted 4 valuable years of intervention or supporting the family in ways who become increasingly stressed. We talked about grief, and I think this mum sums it up for herself as get that grief, put it in a box, crack on, bury that shit deep, deep down. A child psychologist actually in the early stages said to me, and this mum has 2 boys with autism, you know that someday you're going to have to do some grieving about this process. And I said, yep, that's fine. Today is not the day, tomorrow is not the day, and the day after that is not going to be the day either. And it probably won't be that day for another 20 or 30 years. Eventually I'll get to it, but right now I have no time to worry about that stuff. I have to get on with it. I don't have time to fall apart this way. So, after noticing the assessment process, someone said, I describe it as a 2-year process. This is kind of shocking to me. I don't think that's your average in Darwin. That certainly is probably a 1-year process. And I think it also depends how much the parents want it. Obviously, this is for kids with autism or where no one's really sure what's going on with their development. For parents that want it and are very proactive, they do the calling and hounding and badgering and nagging their way up these very long wait lists that Darwin has. But one mum said, I knew it was an assessment, a development assessment, but it felt very clinical and there wasn't a lot of empathy. I just felt like I had to justify why my child needed services. I had to put a case forward of why my disabled child needs help, and this mother already had a diagnosis. I just felt like that maybe wasn't my ideal experience coming into a new service. And this other mum said, one of the problems in Darwin is you hassle people, you get on a list, they leave, they do the assessment report, or they don't do the assessment report. They might meet you might talk about your issues, they don't do a report, they leave, and they pass it on to the next person who comes in, so they get a new provider. And this is for families quite frustrating with registrars cycle through in Darwin. And I think sometimes registrars come in, it's not true in all places that doctors get to make the autism diagnosis. In other places, there's different procedures for it. So for new registrars, they just do not want to make this diagnosis. And they'll be on the phones to clinicians, they'll be on the phone to the family, and then just wait it out until they leave town, I think, sometimes. So that they don't have to be the one that makes a diagnosis that someone might later say, oh, I don't know if that's really right. No one's saying anything good about the assessment process, let me put it that way. It's probably the biggest frustration, and the families that have quite short assessment processes are funding them themselves privately, and it's quite expensive. The other thing about the assessment process is that actually nobody really knows what the assessment process is. I think if I asked a bunch of doctors and I asked a bunch of clinicians, they will tell you a different way that which you can go and get a diagnosis if you have concerns about your child. So I think one of the things that's come out of this research is we need to map this for families. They shouldn't have to guess. They shouldn't have to work so hard if they want a diagnosis. Okay. For the children in this study, 22 were seen at Carpentaria. Most of them had interacted with one or more service providers in Darwin, including psychologists, speech pathologists, occupational therapists. Occupational therapy for kids is one of these services that most kids, I would say, are going to. Parents will take bad services over no services. There's other research that supports this, right? They're told they need to get into services, they're going to get into services. And yet services are difficult to navigate. Very few people are sure about the process. I've talked about this. Parents wish there were more options. And anyway, they're not really sure of the available options. And once again, it's something early childhood intervention Australia has been talking about for a long time. I think it's necessary that we do a mapping of who is, it is hard, people change, but who is around generally. If your child has autism, there's an advisor to help families navigate services in Darwin, and she is wonderful. If your child doesn't have autism, you just don't have access to her. But back to this point of parents will take bad services over no services, I'm going to read you an anecdote about this. We've been seeing a clinician who we saw for 10 sessions. We did it through funding we had available. They paid for the sessions and they referred us to this particular clinician. We got absolutely nothing out of her. She was a lovely lady. Ben got on okay with her. He talked to her, interacted with her well enough with the games that she would play with him. But with Ben's autism, he hates losing or getting out in the game. Can't handle that. And if things don't go his way, he has trouble dealing with that as well. So she'd play games with him. She'd purposely do things to upset him to see how he'd react. And that, obviously, if they were doing matching pairs and she knew there was a pair that he wanted to find, she'd find it. He'd get upset because he really wanted that pair. She'd win and then he'd get upset because he lost and that kind of thing. He'd end up having a massive meltdown. Then for the rest of the session, we'd be trying to get him out of his meltdown, and then it was time to go. Every time, same thing. We didn't progress. She didn't have any recommendations for us how to help deal with his behaviour, how to get through certain situations. And after 10 sessions, we accomplished absolutely nothing, because everyone ended up being exactly the same. And then she goes on to say, we got funded for another 10 sessions, and we went. And you're like, hang on a second. So So really, families feel like doing something is better than nothing, despite the fact that services are often something that also cause stress. Never-ending appointments, having to take time off work. That's the downside of it. And then on the bright side, people say interventions were helpful. They were needed. They changed our lives. We spent a lot of time reflecting. We often don't get that in the real world. So I've really talked about this. Families on the whole just aren't sure what to do about NDIS. No one really is sure what to do about NDIS. But one of the big concerns is, that there just aren't the range of services to pick from that literature would suggest they have. I'm going to switch gears now. I'm going to talk about schools. There were more children in schools than expected in this study, certainly. 12 were in mainstream public schools, 2 were in Catholic schools, and 1 was in a special school. And despite starting this research in early intervention, I really thought, because it was so little, there wouldn't be that back and forth with schools. I can't think of any that weren't somehow in connection with the Department of Education. For example, student services will take referrals when they're as young as 3, thinking ahead to going into preschool. Overall, I'd say what families say about schools is teachers and administrators in school, they either make life much easier for them or they make life much harder. And many of the children in this cohort are actually in special schools and their parents love these schools. I think this is interesting because outside of Darwin, no one is funding special schools. That's a pretty blanket statement, but it's, in the last 20 years, the move has definitely been towards mainstream integration. I would say globally. And the fact that we still build new special schools and have budgets for special schools is interesting. Nonetheless, parents in these schools love these schools. They don't have the worries that families do when their children are in mainstream schools. But the thing parents worry about most is not their children's academic abilities, it's about friendship. They're really worried about friendship. They really want their children to have friends, and they want it very, very badly. There was just so many nice stories about schools in Darwin, which I think schools often get such bad press. It was really nice to hear. One mum said we had 2 awful daycare experiences, and I went into school, I was ready for battle, and they were just wonderful. I didn't have to fight for anything, and I felt really listened to. Everything has just gone really smoothly. And it's such a relief because if school doesn't work, nothing else works. She's anxious about one thing, everything else is a lot harder, so it's really important that it went well, and it has. And we're lucky at this school, they're wonderful. They know James now, and they can see he's a bright boy, and his teacher is just, she's never allowed to leave. In fact, we're going to have to make sure she's his teacher forever until year 12. I don't care if she's only doing early childhood or lower primary, she's going to have to pick up some skills. Families also, I asked them about, well, what advice do you have for teachers generally? And their advice is when you're interacting with children, just really come down to their level, make it as clear as possible, keep it simple. But parents want teachers to see the child as a whole individual and look at their strengths as well as their challenges. One mum said, I know they're busy, but if they sometimes could give you just a couple of minutes. Most of the teachers I got are awesome, but early on I felt I was doing something wrong with his first teacher, like I wasn't able to control him, and that I'd gone wrong somewhere, and I would say to her, what do I do? And Mum went on to say, no, she doesn't know what to do either, but what was happening from this experience with this first teacher is the teacher was making Mum feel like it was her fault that her child couldn't get it together in school day after day. So across the board, families say, treat each child as an individual, try and understand them if they've got special needs, accommodate those. Another story, we found out that Brett learns a lot better in the kind of environment where he can do it his way rather than the strict way of sitting on the floor. The children, the rest of the class do understand that, and they've asked, why does Brett get to sit at the table? And he pipes up and says, because otherwise I'll distract you or I'll get distracted. So he actually knows and understands the reasons as well, and we've accepted that. So yeah, I just think we need to acknowledge each child as an individual and try and work out what their needs are from the start, and then do what they can to work with them rather than against them. same my other mum said, if there's a kid, the naughty kid, there's a reason behind everything. We need to know the kid, you need to know the individual, you need to know their strengths and weaknesses. And I've definitely heard stories of kids in transition, they're little, they've been like suspended 6 times, it's ridiculous. One mum said her teacher every Wednesday would say to her, I'm very tired, and you're very tired, and he's very tired. Perhaps you shouldn't come back to school until Monday. And this was their routine. She just took him to school Monday through Wednesday, and on Wednesday the teacher suggested that they didn't come back till Monday. Interesting, right? Okay. So, really a mix, I would say, across the board. With, there are lots of good stories, and some things you're like, wow, that shouldn't happen. That's not just true of schools, that's also true of clinical work, I would say, as well. One of the things that has come out is that many of our families, they don't go out in the community, actually. This is really an area of stress. This mum said sometimes it's a challenge because sometimes they do unusual things. Yesterday we went for lunch outside, we left our table and was just running around other tables. But this is a mum who also goes on to say, I really tightly control where I take my child. Look, he's not always enjoyable, but it's very structured. I'll take him to certain places, I know how he'll behave, I know how he'll react, and I can predict his behaviour. Some things we just do and see what happens. Shopping is at a few places and he gets very excited, but he won't grab everything from the aisle or he won't go to that certain toy. I mean, I'm pretty structured and I just try and make it easier for all of us, which often when they say this means we don't go out. I had one child that I used to see, and I said, we set up in for play one day at this little supermarket, and Mum looked at me and she's like, he has never been to a supermarket and I have 4 kids, are you crazy? And I was like, okay, who knew? I hadn't thought. We think about that as a place that families would go to. There's a new Woolworths down in Palmerston Way, I don't know which one it is. So often it comes off, parents are like, but not that Woolworths, never that Woolworths is the worst. And so what's happening is they're finding these specific places where they're just like, we can't go there, we just can't manage that. But there are other things that because of the lighting or because of the environment, it's just a little easier to manage. One of the other things that I think have come out of this is that families really need to connect with each other. And I think this is another area that clinically, perhaps even educationally, that as a community we need to really be thinking about. The families, once again, if your child has autism, I think there's better things in place for you. I heard recently that they're doing minesweeper groups for older kids, like as a social group that they can get together, and there are events for families. But if your child isn't on the spectrum, there might not be these same opportunities. One mum said there was a little play group that was good, and she didn't really think her child got anything out of it, but she thought that she did, because she said, even though, in theory there are other parents out there, actually meeting them is a huge thing, and some of the mums that she's still in contact. So I think this will be another area that needs to come up for discussion with agencies about how are we going to support families. One of the big problems with NDIS is a lot of the support that would have been done in the case management that would have been done as a part of clinical loads has to be funded now. It has to be billed to someone. So how does that get paid for? Who then takes up those responsibilities? Where are those gaps going to surface? I mean, a playgroup wouldn't be such an issue because technically if the child is there, that's something that can be looked for. And I think it's totally sad that we've got to this spot where you can't do anything unless it can be billed to somebody's package, which seems to be where it's going. One of the advantages, I sort of mentioned not having older students, the 13-year-olds, is we really hear very little about teenagers with disabilities relative to what we hear about little ones with disabilities. And I think these parents can really provide some useful insight into how life changes and improves. For little ones, major concerns might be toilet training. A school has told them they can't come to this school unless they can toilet train their child. That's not allowed, by the way, but it happens. And so parents will get really, really consumed at certain times about specific issues. And so for the parents of teenagers, they've moved past a lot of that. One father was saying, when his kids were little, they ran away all the time. They pretty much had to have the house on lockdown. Everything had to be on lockdown. And that's no longer true. Life's become a lot easier. And I think for some of our families who are really struggling, and we know they're struggling because in other research, we basically have stress measures on these families. And they're concerning. So to have a parent that's been through it and gotten to an older stage, be able to say, oh yeah, that was really hard. I think parents find those young years maybe a bit more difficult anyway. I don't know, I don't have kids, but my understanding is. So some of those stresses of having and managing little ones do appear to lessen as they get older. And I just think that maybe hearing a bit more from these older students, we might have a better idea of what the span looks like for kids, particularly kids in school. So where to next? I need to finish the study. And there's certainly data here that speaks to the necessity for community services to support families become advocates for their child. And I think that's something that needs to happen now, because if NDIS is coming in next year, families will be open for enrolment in January, then families really need to have an understanding of what that role is. Some parents are already really good at this. Some parents we know this is not a strength, especially if your child has got a diagnosis and maybe you don't want the diagnosis, or maybe mum's accepted that they've got a diagnosis and dad does not think there's anything wrong, which is not uncommon. How do we prepare those parents to do that? Okay. I think the work of stories really reminds us about the human aspect of having a child with special needs. I hope I didn't emphasize the stresses today, maybe I did. But also there's a lot of joys, and I think as I am writing, I will be very conscious of that. Those moments, those amazing small moments that parents have with their children. I think also in the research we hear about strategies that some schools use to make families feel welcome. And I'd like to think more about these strategies. What are some teachers doing? What are some schools doing? And how can we recommend that more schools would take on board some of these ideas? We also hear about unkind things educators say, clinicians say and do, and how much hurt that causes. And from other research I've done around storytelling, I think we forget. We all think about things in years and time, but actually people live in moments. And so those tiny little moments, that not nice thing because someone is at the end of that rope, they stick. And they stick for a long time and they really hurt people's feelings, and they're the kinds of things that come out in this research. It's just how much weight they often take when the person who, threw the bar probably doesn't remember ever saying it. And just to think about those moments, I would say for these families often it's the joy that's occurring in moments too. The joy isn't occurring blanket across their day, because the one thing about disability for kids that get a diagnosis, kids are born with something, is it's ongoing. As clinicians, the most difficult child, sometimes at the end of an hour you're like, oh my goodness. And teachers, I'm sure at the end of the day, are like, I'm exhausted. But these families, they live with these children, and they live with the difficulties. And it's not just like this week and this year, this goes, on and on. And I think they're things that we really just need to continually remind ourselves of. as a person who doesn't have a child with disability. Future research. This has made me really want to interview teachers about inclusion and what it means and how they do it, particularly in those schools who parents tell us that they do this well. And I'm also curious, I was also thinking the other day, it would be good to interview children, not 3-year-olds, sort of those middle ages, and young people about friendship. What does friendship mean? How are they conceptualizing friendship? How are they thinking about friendship? Because for the kids that really struggle to make friendships, I think we have to do a better job at explicitly helping them make friends. And I'll give you an example. I think if you have a child that has autism and they want to play with kids, if the teacher says, say to them, I want to play with you, kids generally be like, okay. You know, they're not going to say no. Saying, can I play with you is no good. That's a question that you can say no, right? It has to be a statement. And telling kids with autism, oh, go over there and play with them is no good because they don't know how to do that. They really need, like, explicit, what is it you want me to do to make this work? And, you know, I think in a way, our teachers trying to equip with, you know, to teach kids about friendship, I don't know. Some could argue that's outside of their scope of practice, but really for parents and for a lot of young children, certainly kids with autism, this is really the social engagement is really the biggest challenge. And I would argue if we can better manage some of the social engagement, we probably wouldn't have some of the behaviour issues that that children are dealing with. Because what they're doing is we would call unhelpful connecting, right? If you're going to get attention, if you're going to get interaction, it has to be by doing something that makes you a nuisance. That's what you're going to do. I'll give you an example, a small example. A child, no friends. I observed him at childcare, would just like stand along the fence pretty much all day, and then realize if he stole children's hats, it caused like massive hullabaloo. It's like nick the hat, run. Everyone would chase him. They were yelling, "Oh, give it back, give it back!" It was just like this big thing. He just thought this was the most tremendous fun. It sounds fun actually, but people were getting really mad because he wasn't allowed to steal hats. And my point is, perhaps if you give him another way to interact with his peers, then he doesn't have to be so annoying about it. Okay. What have I learned? I think that really the examples families give me really help inform my teaching. I teach inclusion here for potential future teachers. Really help me inform my teaching. Help me like put into context the kinds of readings I'm assigning to students and the teaching that they're going to have to do. And clinically, I think I'm much braver about suggesting further assessment and diagnosis when I work with children who I think are clearly on the spectrum, even when parents really don't want to hear it. It's just, you know, I think that's the one thing about the teachers and clinicians, we have a pretty good broad overview of child development. Because we can see so many kids, sometimes it's a little more obvious when something isn't typical. And I'm not talking about just mild difference, I'm talking about something that's like really strikes you as quite different. And families don't often have that context. They might not have known, you know, 500 other 3-year-olds to know that, well, 3-year-olds would usually have this skill set, so to speak. All right, that's it. That's all I have. Any questions? Yes?
Well, I did some maths work in a school last year, and so when I went in, I was surprised with the number of children with additional needs within a regular classroom setting. And to be honest, that part of my I was a little bit concerned, like I was like, oh my gosh, how am I going to deal with this? I haven't taught in a classroom now for over 5 years, and like, have I lost these skills? And I was wondering, well, how will the children deal with this? Because there were some children there who had some quite severe and disruptive behaviours, but what stood out to me immediately was that the children were really accepting of these children with additional needs and would sort of work in and around with them, and sometimes they couldn't work with them because the child with the additional needs was quite over the top. But I was surprised at how accepting the children were that, hey, this is fine, we understand that this child needs the cushion to sit on, this child needs the teddy to hold, that they will sit there, that they will throw the tantrum because it didn't go the way they were. And so I don't know if that is a learnt behaviour from the children from this prior interaction, or if it was the teacher who was scaffolding this. But from my interactions, I think there are some really positive elements going on in schools. But it is really tricky as a teacher to have to then put so much of your time and energy and effort into this child who,
I think as a school of education, it's something we have to think more about. You know, it's not enough that students get one course on inclusion because, you know, it comes up in a couple of other places, but, you know, these children are going to be in mainstream classrooms. It just is, and you're not going to have one of them, you're often going to have many. And helping teachers to cope with that, especially beginning teachers. But I would say with children, I find that often the children are fine, like children are pretty accepting. What you'll see sometimes is when the teacher or the adult, and I haven't seen this in Darwin, but from other work I've done, and when the adult stops being accepting and starts really being kind of mean to that child, then the kids start to be mean to that child, but that's okay. And then there are other times, there was a little child I saw many, many years ago, and Mum was super worried about him. He didn't talk at all. He might be on the spectrum. She wasn't really sure. Mum was super worried about this kid. She changed childcare. And the popular kid decided that her son was like going to be the Robin to his Batman. And it was amazing. He was just like the most popular kid at school, except for the other one. And you just think, wow, I just loved this little stranger child who no one had planned on. Yeah, how do we capitalize on that? Maybe with some kids who we know some kids have social capital, some kids don't have any social capital. Maybe we need to think more about getting some of those kids involved in a way. And you know, there are stories that I've heard from my students, not through this research, that like a school was putting a child with autism in a bike cage at lunchtime because they could control him. That is like just straight up against the law. It's got to be. Like, this is Australia, for goodness sake. But other schools will do the same sort of thing in a gentler way. All children with autism are in a corridor. And once again, this is not a Darwin story, it's an Australian story. Are made to stay inside in a corridor and do puzzles because they're easier to manage that way. You know, if that's your child, this isn't okay. And I really get the challenges, right? This seems like an easy and good solution for what to do with these difficult kids. You know, many parents seem to pick schools by whether or not they have a fence around them. Who knew? Who thought? Probably not any of us, because we don't have kids that run away. That's what the main concern is. You know, well, we're meant to go to that school, we're not going there because they don't have a fence. Once again, that also seems like a fairly simple thing to fix. Or even, you know, a smaller playground area for our little ones. Yeah.
A colleague at School of Education, Alison Marchbank, has written a piece on what you were talking about earlier, about the new model that NDIS brings in terms of providing services for families. And I mean, she talks about the fact that the old non-government agencies who used to provide this sort of support, because they're not getting funding, they're whipping on the line, and the community is losing that expertise. And I was just wondering whether it would be useful to sort of link up with her in terms of sort of exploring this issue, because it seems like that the NDIS is throwing the baby out with the bathwater in many ways by having this sort of we only fund services that we can bill for, because that works for intelligent, engaged, middle-class mums, but it doesn't necessarily work for everybody.
Yeah, I would say, even one of the real interesting, I guess, the model, the preferred model in NDIS is called transdisciplinary service. Carpentry is truly a transdisciplinary service, not many agencies are. What this means is, as a family, you get one therapist, they're assigned to you, and over time that therapist might change, but the team all knows about your child. And so speech might not come in until a bit later. You've got another therapist, and they're just working on general developmental goals. But in order to work in a transdisciplinary way, it requires a lot of teaming. So for Carpentaria, historically, they've met 2 full days as a whole team in a meeting every quarter to make sure that that work could happen. So transdisciplinary teaming is what is being basically prescribed as best practice. There's no money for meeting. So the idea is, when are people meant to find out about the information about the children? And there's no money really. My understanding is there isn't money for parents. And so John Callahan's doing his PhD, and he's been basically collecting lots and lots of data around stress and parent efficacy and competency and how they view their parenting skills. And parents, this is like much greater stress than you would see in a typical population. So how there's all these big mental health programs, but actually how are we thinking about parents in relation to children with disabilities and early intervention? Because again, they're the people that make the choices, they're the people that bring them there, and we just know that really they're quite overwhelmed.